Okay, welcome back to another Zeller podcast. Today we have Dominic. Dominic is the COO of Lisk, a L2 solution built on the OP stack focused on emerging markets. Dominic is a special guest not only because he and Lisk are a partner of Zeller, helping us build the Zeller passport, but Dominic himself also has a deadly track record being an ex-founder in the Web2 space. We'll get it all through today. Dominic, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So Dominic, Lisk and Zeller are working together to launch the Zeller Passport in Indonesia. And for the audience who are not entirely sure of what is Lisk and why particularly Indonesia, could you share a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So just to give a bit of context, so Lisk has been around in the Web3 space since 2016. So we're like one of the OG building teams, kind of been in the space from the very beginning or from the very early days. We were one of the first ICOs right after Ethereum. And, we've always, the purpose of the company was always to help democratize access to Web3 technology and also to help scale blockchains, right? So at the beginning, we saw that those were going to be kind of two of the key things. We saw that it was going to, this was going to be a long road, right, to really reach mainstream adoption where the technology is ready to kind of have everyday use cases for people. And the other piece was obviously that, blockchain technology, especially at the time, was very limited. And that, again, to make it something that, normal applications could run on, scaling would be one of the main challenges to conquer, right? And so at the time that meant, very early days, Ethereum was just starting. That was like, 2016, 2017 bull run. Very early, crazy ICOs, it was kind of the Wild West. And so what we had focused on at the time was building a layer one from scratch, from the ground up, right? Not copying anything based on JavaScript, with the idea being that, again, the amount of JavaScript developers there are in the world, let's just get this technology in their hands and allow them to start building and experimenting with it. And two, when we started looking at, scaling solutions and primarily we were one of the first chains to build app-specific sidechain infrastructure, right? Which is now also has been built by Cosmos and Polkadot. And so Lisk was also a pioneer there. It ended up being so, again, we just saw that as the market matured, especially over the last year and a half, 2 years, you started to see certain things kind of emerge. So one, we thought that really the layer two scaling solutions on top of Ethereum were providing a better solution than the app-specific sidechain model. And you can see that now. If you look at like Polkadot and Cosmos, there's not that much traction there, in comparison to layer twos, which are kind of exploding and just, again, the daily active users, the number of applications, TVL and stuff just kind of keeps skyrocketing higher. And so, again, and just in terms of, the mission to help democratize access to it, we just saw that the industry had really solidified in what we think around Ethereum, right? So we're big believers in Ethereum and what's been built there, the community that's been built there. And that's not to discredit other layer ones, Solana and a few other are interesting what they're building. But if you look at if you look at TVL numbers, user metrics, Ethereum still kind of dwarfs them. And it's really, to be honest, it's a credit. It's really amazing what's happened on Ethereum, right? The fact that there was so many projects, Lisk being one of them, that tried to kind of compete or tried to provide an alternative solution. And even though there was, they had clear limitations with, high fees and slow, low transaction throughput, the ability for the community to kind of stay there and build open source and kind of continue to grow organically is really a testament to that community and the underlying technology there. And now with layer twos, obviously you're seeing kind of this explosion. And what we think is really finally you're seeing the real promise of Ethereum be capable. I think somebody said recently on X, forgetting who it was, so excuse me if that person watches this, but that kind of, L2s are kind of the consumer layer for Ethereum. And I think that really is true. And so we're excited to be part of that and just to continue moving our mission forward as a layer two. So now in terms of our focus as a layer two, we've, as been being builders in the space for a number of years already. We were seeing that a lot of the most interesting use cases and applications for blockchain technology were coming in regions like Southeast Asia and in Africa and others, right? And so with the layer two, we decided, like, look, we can double down, we can become a layer two. We can join the OP Superchain, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, which we think is also like one of the most exciting places to be building for ourselves, but also for like application developers, for users. I mean, what's about to be unlocked there is pretty massive. And then also, again, like, we can kind of be a little bit more niche, since we're a layer two and we'll be more interoperable with other layer twos. We don't need to focus on creating like a global community. We can kind of focus more, still global, but more on certain markets that we think are most interesting and where we have had the most connection with builders and just want to keep supporting them there. So that's kind of how very high level background about Lisk, where we transitioned to a layer two and why we're focused on Indonesia and a few other markets as a layer two.
Yeah, I do want to get into what the OP stack is and some of these use cases, but I wanted to take us back first to the very beginning of Lisk, or around the time when we had the Ethereum Killers season come out. Mm-hmm. Lisk sort of had a very strong narrative, which was you were basically Ethereum, but you could do it on JavaScript, which at the time there was a lot of developers who didn't understand Solidity. JavaScript was just the right language to bring massive onboarding. But eventually Lisk ended up transitioning to a layer two because it was not unsuccessful as a layer one. What sort of actually happened there, and why do you think that actually happened as at the time when Lisk was doing a layer one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things, right? I mean, I think, again, like, building a layer one blockchain from scratch is a lot of work, but it's also that, again, like, everything, you're not composable, right? So you're not able to really take something that somebody else has built when you're building something from scratch, right? And so it meant that, we had a team that had to kind of go through all the development cycles of pushing a layer one out in kind of a bubble, right? And so that made it challenging in a number of aspects, right? Like, just, again, I mean, for our own team in terms of building it out, and we ended up completing it, right? So we have completed that layer one with interoperability among side chains, and that project continues, it's been taken over by a community team, and they've now rebranded to a name called Claire, but that, a chain based on that technology still exists. But yeah, again, I think, again, like, we talk about, like, and we'll talk more about this with what's happening on the Superchain, but interoperability was always kind of the end goal. But, we were building in kind of a siloed ecosystem. And of course you can bridge to that, right? But, like, if you're talking to partners and the amount of, dev support, integrations, whether it's oracles, bridges, API providers, it doesn't really matter. All these things, if they were going to integrate with Lisk, they had to do custom integrations, which became very difficult and costly for them to do. So that was kind of a challenge just in terms of getting a network up and running. And then, I mean, the other big thing was that I think with JavaScript, I mean, there was two things with JavaScript developers. One is just we just noticed, we realized from experience of dealing with them for many years that there was a lot of excitement. Like, even that narrative today stands true. Like, if you talk to people who may not know so much about Web3 or haven't, started building yet, the idea of being able to build with JavaScript is very exciting, and that, like, kind of catches people's imagination right away. But as they start to get serious and dive into it, I mean, kind of two things happen. One is that we just noticed that, like, the majority of JavaScript developers weren't so excited about Web3 yet, at least, let's say that. There wasn't that large of an interest from that demographic in actually building. And the other piece was that, Solidity and Rust and a few others, they've been developed for smart contract development. And in the end, like, if you're building seriously, like, that makes a difference, right? So, like, what we also found was that, again, maybe a great way to bring initial people in, especially beginner or novice devs in Web3. But as they became more serious, as they really wanted to, kind of commit to building Web3 projects, they quickly found out that, like, Solidity probably would be a better language to build in. And that, like, hurdle of either learning Solidity or hiring a Solidity developer was worth crossing if they were serious. So those were kind of the two big things. And you can see that, again, it's not just with Lisk. I mean, other people have now created JavaScript SDKs, right? I think Near has one. I know there's Web3.js is one of the oldest public goods on Ethereum, and just there's not a ton of traction around those. So,
yeah. The one thing I'm very impressed about Lisk is that you guys are very focused on your mission, which is that you realize that having a layer one solution was not as effective, and you're very open about you shifting over to a layer two and focusing on these emerging markets and these real world use cases. And that was really sort of like the initial reason why we from Zeller were quite attracted to working with you guys, because you guys really knew what you were going after. And so I'm really curious to hear from you as to what was the driver for why it's so important for you guys to focus on the real world use cases. Because there's a lot of layer twos out there who are on the OP stack. There's Base, that I think just recently announced they had a very, very large TVL. But you guys are taking a different route. And for those who are out there who are interested in building, why is it so important that Web3 starts to move to this real world adoption?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, we could talk about this for the whole podcast, right? I mean, because there's so many different angles to go down. You could start with kind of where we're at in the adoption cycle. I think Cointelegraph put out a cool graph the other day where, like, just based on adoption versus Web 2, it kind of has us in like 1997 of the internet, right? And I think that's probably pretty accurate. So, I mean, yeah, there's obviously a point there where it's just kind of these things take time. But, I do think, I think what's interesting with Web3 and what's unique to Web3 is because it's been developed from, I mean, let's not say day one, because Bitcoin and really early Ethereum, probably there was very few people interacting with it. But because of the speculative cycle nature of it, starting in like 2016, 2017, and for a few people even before that, it just grabbed people's attention, and there was just, global access to get involved and invest in these ICOs or in these early stage products. It's, the technology has been developed very publicly with a lot of scrutiny from regulators from day one, right? Like if you look at whether it's AI, I mean, a lot of people talk about AI right now. And, again, like that started being developed like in the 60s or 70s, really, right? We just didn't hear about it because it was in, behind closed doors and institutions, and, it was the researchers and universities working on it. But again, you couldn't invest in it, right? So it was something that was kind of closeted. And the same with, the internet in a lot of ways, right? It didn't really grab global consciousness until kind of like the mid 90s, and then really in the end of the 90s where there was kind of that crazy bull run. And again, people were speculating, investing. And so I think, I think because of that, like it's important that like we have to kind of fight a battle that some of these other technology industries haven't had to fight so publicly, which is kind of always showing that there's kind of like two sides to this, right? There's like the speculative casino side to it, and there's like the technological side to it, which is what I think a lot of the people who are building seriously in the space are most passionate about, and where like, a lot of VCs are backing companies. But like there's real power in the underlying technology of blockchain to improve a lot of things, whether it's, we want to call it like Web 3.0, right? Like where you can kind of own your own content, you can own your own data. It can be much more equitable in terms of, sharing rewards that these big, that the internet provides. Whether, again, like we can talk about many different things there, right? Whether it's transparency around, voting, around payments, having global payments, fraction of a cost, without limitations, without barriers. There's so many things that this technology can do. And but again, in the mainstream consciousness, people, especially in the West, right? And that's part of the reason we also focus on markets like Indonesia, is just, we found that there's a different understanding of the technology. Oftentimes, not always, there's obviously speculation still too as well, but like there's more a desire to kind of see how technology can help improve, economic standing, or, create new business models. There's a real openness to that, where I think in the West, it's kind of, again, it's seen mostly as speculative, and even like the use cases are more like very high level, like, oh, we're gonna we're going to improve the back end of the financial industry, which is, interesting. And I think that'll, also benefit kind of the financial industry as a whole, and maybe provide more transparency, and again, create more efficiency there. But it's not going to solve like kind of, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect you on a day-to-day basis. Right. So I think a lot of the solutions that we're seeing that are interesting being built are coming from markets like Indonesia. And so that's why we want to double down on that, right? So it's like, we've always been kind of focused very long term. Like we never bought too much into the speculative nature of the industry, and we had to kind of fight that from an early stage too. And the intention was always to build very long term and see this through, and see it kind of provide the benefits that we saw from an early stage could come from this technology, and support those builders, right? Like as an infrastructure layer, we're basically, we're a tool for applications and founders and developers to use to build on top of, and then we can kind of, we can select where we want to focus the majority of our own efforts and our own, grant funding, et cetera, incubator programs, and like which kind of founders do we want to support. And so, we kind of call that like real world applications. I think, there's a lot of terminology in the industry that can get very confusing, and it shifts, and it's kind of like everybody uses it for different, slightly different meanings, whether it's real world assets or real world applications, or now we're talking about consumer apps. In some ways, to me, a lot of them there's a lot of overlap there, but just again, like where is this technology really being adopted in ways that kind of solve problems, in ways that engage users. It can be also a fun thing. Like gaming is cool too, right? Like I think that's a real world application. It's just we're trying to kind of stay away from too much of the speculative thing, just because we think that there's enough of that in the industry. It's giving us a bit of a bad rap.
You mentioned how AI was being developed for 20 years plus prior to ChatGPT coming out and becoming really the very strong product market fit for the retail level. And some people would say that crypto itself, outside of the speculative nature, outside of exchanges and predictive markets, has not had its ChatGPT moment yet. What is your perspective on that? And maybe what are you seeing from these markets that you're entering in as to how they are really adopting blockchain for the retail or the mass adoption level?
Yeah. I mean, I do think so. We definitely haven't had that moment, right? Because that's like global awareness. I mean, you could say in Web 2, maybe it was Facebook, maybe one of those platforms, maybe it was YouTube, one of those platforms that kind of really took off and showed what was possible there. We're not there yet. I mean, I do think again, like if you take us being in 1997 just as an example, I think we're still a few years away from that. And I do think that the majority of that comes down to still infrastructure improvements, whether it's on a base layer, or like whether it's transaction throughput and fees, or whether it's UI and UX on the application level. I do think, we're making huge improvements. If you've been around in the space for a few years, even like from 2020, if you look at the type of UI and UX in terms of applications, whether it's a wallet, like Seller does a great example of this, but you just see the improvement steadily getting better. Like if you look at the social platforms too, right? Like if you look at Steemit back in the day versus Farcaster today, it's night and day better. It's just now like to me, there's still these like few edges that need to be refined a bit further. And I do think that'll take another year or two. But then I think, the technology will be at a place where, we can just start building applications that, again, somebody who doesn't know anything about Web3 can just use, and they won't even know that they're on Web3, right? And then an application can just, take off based on, the value it's providing, or, the niche that it's serving. And the blockchain aspect will just be kind of a background. I do think, what's happening on the OP Superchain, and you mentioned Base, I do think there's a lot of interesting things there being developed that's kind of showing the way forward. And to the second part of the question, I do, again, so that's kind of like for global, like to have like some kind of hit where everybody goes, oh yeah, I use that application and I didn't even know it was on blockchain, or now I get it. I still think it's a little, again, probably a few years away. But in terms of, again, in emerging markets, like I think, there's different things are being adopted in different areas. Like obviously in areas where there's unstable currency, we've seen that's kind of been the biggest kind of, it's kind of ChatGPT moment in those countries, right? Just because, being able to hold dollars on chain is so valuable, and being able to kind of transact outside of the local, banking system is just like a lifeline, right? So because it's such a pressing need, it's such a pain point to individuals in these markets, you've seen tremendous adoption around that, right? And I think like things like Tron Pay and Binance Pay were the ones who benefited from that initially. And, again, like that's kind of what we're bullish on, is that, with layer twos, with, something like Lisk, we basically can, we're even more attractive than Tron Pay or Binance Pay, right? Because we're even cheaper now as a layer two. You still get the Ethereum security. And so applications like that, use cases like that can now be built on top of Ethereum for the first time. So we're super bullish on that. And I think a lot of the adoption is going to come back to Ethereum. But yeah, a lot of things around payments, which is kind of spoken about a lot, remittances. But what I do think is also, and was always an interesting aspect of Web3, right? Like if you talk to people who were very involved in Web 1 and Web 2, like some people, especially in like Silicon Valley, will refer to it as, kind of there was like this read era first, which was Web 1, which was like things were published online. And then like Web 2 was really read and write, which was like empowering individual users to kind of post their own, create their own content, basically, right? Whether it's X or YouTube or whatever platform, but basically creating building the creator economy. And that was kind of read write. And now, like, we're talking about with Web3, kind of this read, write, own movement, right? So you can not only write your own content, but you can also own it and get monetized around that. And I think, some of, the initial idea around the internet was actually that there would be these kind of much more local use cases and communities. And like somebody locally in Indonesia, for example, could publish something. And again, it may not become a global sensation, but like in that local community, it would be something that's very valuable, and they'd be rewarded for creating that. And I do think that you're starting to see some of that take place in Web3, which is really positive. And I know everybody's chasing these kind of, where there's the most traction, just because we're not quite fully at scale yet. Like if you look at the Web3 industry compared to other industries, we're still very small. And that's, again, part of the reason we love being part of the Superchain, is this idea of like, let's stop competing all the time and let's build together, because we still need to make these improvements on UX, UI, and infrastructure to really get to the next level. And so again, so saying that, but, again, seeing like local use cases, right? So whether it's a local coffee collective in Africa tokenizing their trees, right, and allowing the local community to kind of invest in the trees and the output. And that's not like that's not a solution that's going to, drive, millions of transactions per month or something like that. But it's something that's like solving a local problem. It's getting people involved. And it's allowing people to kind of have, clear ownership which is immutable, in local communities, which kind of empowers local communities to kind of think differently and kind of scale up on their own. So we see a lot of those examples, and like, so we're really, I think that's something that we're looking to support. And maybe one of the things that we're looking to support that not many others are looking to support, just because, again, from their, bottom line in terms of what they're trying to do from an infrastructure standpoint, like it doesn't maybe make as much sense for them. Happy to answer more on that if you want to kind of dive even deeper there.
Yeah, I just wanted to dive into what is something that you would have liked to see, or what is something that you would like to see come out of these emerging markets for the use case of Lisk?
Sure. I think, again, like I won't even say what I would like. We're seeing it happen, right? Like I can give you a few examples, right? So like in Indonesia, I think you've met Nino, who's part of our community, and, he's a well-known actor there locally, right? Fernandez, and he's building this application which allows for movie extras to kind of be cast and paid in a very transparent way, right? So like that is, he's coming from an experience of being in the film industry there locally for many years and seeing this inefficiency, right? Like, and he could explain it much better than I can, but just around, again, extras being, double cast, people getting, it's a very obscure system which doesn't really work. People game it. The filming producers, can't really rely on it. There's a lot of inefficiencies. So he's solving that, right? So, and blockchain kind of fits that perfectly, right? So like that's a great example. But then there's just so many other examples, right? So I mean, we work with a project who's founded by a second-time founder. He's Nigerian originally, but he lives in San Francisco now because his first startup was successful enough that Pandora flew him out to San Francisco a number of years ago and ended up giving him a job. And he's kind of, so he's building a podcast network, a content network, which is, again, based like each podcast is an NFT. So why is that interesting? At first, you think like, okay, well, like owning a podcast, is that really interesting? But there's a few things that really unlock. So like one, I mean, it's giving a voice to the voices in emerging markets that maybe not as prioritized by these big tech companies like YouTube, right? Like there's a lot of public discourse around the monetization differentiation between, emerging market creators versus Western creators and who gets paid what. So one is trying to solve that. But two, it's kind of, it's if you think in local communities around the world, like so much of history has been transposed via storytelling, right? Like community elders, vocal stories. And a lot of this stuff hasn't been recorded. And so to be able to record this kind of history, this knowledge, and keep it in a way that's immutable, it can't be changed, nobody could tamper with it down the road, is super powerful, right? So he's working on that. And there's many other things that you can kind of add into that, but kind of like high level, that's what he's trying to work on, which again is both a local, but it's also kind of a global solution in terms of providing a better platform. And he's been building, streaming services, for 10 years. So, again, if very knowledgeable about the space in terms of what's needed there. So that's something we're super bullish on. We have another project that's building kind of more a prediction market locally, right? And that, again, is that speculative or not? But we think that that's kind of a real world application for blockchain. And that just drives, again, people's interest in it. And it's a little, it's more of a fun aspect of Web3, but it is, they allow you to, the team's called Soccerism. They allow you to, basically anybody can add their own thing for you to bet on in terms of prediction. So it's kind of a decentralized prediction market, which is really interesting. I do think, again, like we would love to see. I think what's interesting with the Indonesian market, for example, is that we're like locally we work with the government there, and specifically the Kominfo branch of the Indonesian government, and like there's a lot of openness there. So again, depending on the market, like there's some markets where maybe like people are trying to escape whether it's kind of the currency situation, and there's other emerging markets that we're finding that kind of there's the government's very supportive of the local startup ecosystem and trying to kind of use new technologies and see where it can be most beneficial. So I think like in Indonesia, one of the things we're really interested to see is kind of how will the regulation there unfold. I know there's a lot being worked on at the moment, and how can that, how committed is the government to really let this technology kind of breathe on its own and let founders maybe, push the boundaries a little bit, right? Like we're not trying to say like do things that are illegal. Nobody's in support of that, but just kind of to allow a new technology to take off. Sometimes the boundaries need to be pushed a little bit, and to kind of see. I think it's very positive that they're very open to it. We're working with them directly right now, and doing a startup incubator with them. But I do think again, I think that's going to be kind of a big deciding factor on what can get built. Is our governments who are supportive of new technology, are they really open? And that's not just Indonesia, right? That's globally in terms of government support, right? Like in terms of like it's a huge problem in the West right now, in the US, for example, just the lack of regulatory clarity, and a lot of people in like the United States government, for example, who are still trying to really crack down on Web3 technology and only seeing it as speculative kind of criminal technology. And so like again, those globally, that's going to be a big thing. I just think what I'm positive about, and your question was kind of, what do you hope to see? I think that countries like Indonesia can lead the world, right, in terms of showing how government regulation and government can work with startup founders to really create a sandbox environment that is beneficial on all sides for the Web3 ecosystem and founders.
So you guys are built on the OP stack, and there has been a number of different protocols that have tried to solve the problem of interoperability. Namely, there's been Cosmos, Polkadot is one that's also tried to do parachains. Why particularly did you guys go down the route of the OP stack, given that I think probably around this time last year or earlier towards the beginning of the year, the Cosmos ecosystem was like leading the charge, right? Why particularly did you choose the OP stack?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think, with Cosmos, I mean, in total respect to what they've built, to what Polkadot's built, but since we were building something very similar, we kind of understood some of the limitations there. I mean, so just to really easily explain it, and this is oversimplification, but one thing that's a huge problem there is that if you have app-specific sidechains or parachains, right, each chain has to create its own security model. Right. And that's a huge challenge. Right. And both Polkadot and Cosmos have tried to solve this somewhat with kind of a shared security model where they can a chain can use, either Cosmos or Polkadot's underlying security, but it's only for a limited amount of chains. Right. So there's a real challenge to really scale that to something much larger. So that's just, very simply put, because otherwise we could talk about that for a long time too. But that's like one of the main difficulties that we saw and knew that would be really hard for us to get over as well. So we had a kind of a deep understanding of the challenges of that type of architecture. And, we also saw that a few things. I mean, when it comes to Web3 technology and infrastructure, has been this infrastructure race, right? There's so many layer ones, there's so many layer twos. And in reality, I think the industry is still too caught on this idea that we're waiting for this one chain that has slightly lower TPS, slightly higher TPS, or lower fees, et cetera, right? Or has this one unique feature. There's a lot talked about ZK technology, and we also agree that that's kind of where we're going, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And because we all build open source, our team sees that infrastructure will move towards, whether you want to call it a singularity or a single point of kind of, where most of the underlying infrastructure will be very similar in the end, right? Because it's, again, whether it's a ZK tech, we can integrate that in the OP stack, and actually the OP, as a Superchain, we're already working on that behind the scenes. Or whether, again, if you're following along with the Superchain, you're actually seeing in real time, Unichain from Uniswap just got announced last week. And because they've developed, 1 second block times and even sub-second block times, that's now going to be integrated into the Superchain tech stack. So this is real time open source developing, which is just, it's moving very quickly. And, I think getting caught up too much on differentiation right now is not really worthwhile, right? As we've been talking about here today, we're still a few years off probably from where this is really taking off globally, and we've kind of gotten the infrastructure to a level it needs to be at. And so in the meantime, and even at that point, right, it's just going to be, if somebody else is developing something really interesting, we can try to integrate it as well. So that's one piece, right? Is this idea of choosing a tech stack just for the tech is a bit of an outdated model in our opinion, right? It's a very short-sighted thing. Sure, you can jump on ZK EVM and kind of try to ride that wave, but in the end, is that really a long-term benefit to you? Is that a long-term differentiation? We don't think so. So then the question is where who do you want to build with, right? From an ecosystem standpoint, who's building a community, who has the ethos that align with you, right? Where do you feel there's a group of interesting developer teams and communities coming together to work together? And to us, that was very clearly Optimism and the Superchain. And I can go into many reasons there, but Jesse also from Base talks about this quite a bit, right? I think he has this quote where he talks about when he talks to builders, most people don't talk about joining OP or like the OP stack, building on the OP stack from a technical perspective. Like that's not why they're joining. They're joining because there's like a movement happening here. And they want we're building this trust and this excitement in the ecosystem to join. And I think it's very similar. I mean, it's an extension of Ethereum, right? Like we are very closely aligned still with Ethereum, the Optimism team. We're core Ethereum contributors, right? They were the team building Plasma for many years. And that connection to the core Ethereum is still very much there. And I think we're trying to keep that alive. But I say that just because I do think that like the idea of building trust, building community, showing that we are working with developers is a powerful narrative. Like with us, like that's kind of what we're doing in markets like Indonesia, right? It's like we're trying to be there kind of as the local partner, building trust and being like, look, we're not here just to give you, a grant for whatever, and kind of here's the milestones. If you achieve them, you'll get the grant, and then thanks, you can apply for another one, but that's it. Like we're taking a much more hands-on approach of trying to build a set of incubators and, a team that can kind of provide hands-on support. We're like working one-on-one with builders to try and make their application successful, right? Because the app's success is our success, and the current model of just giving out cold grants doesn't work. So we're trying to provide value to local builders, and we can do that because of this interoperability set coming forward. Now, saying all that, as I mentioned with the Uniswap updates, Unichain updates, for example, we do think that like the team and the collective team building on the OP stack, and then Superchain specifically, is one of the best in the industry, right? Like, and that would be more of a technical conversation, but you can just see it, and you can see you can see in the fact that the base team chose to build with Optimism. You can see it that Celos now is moving over to be built on Optimism. You can see it that Sony and Uniswap have now chosen Optimism over other L2s. So Optimism, in the Superchain is definitely winning right now, and I think you're seeing a lot of high quality teams choose that. And again, I don't know the specific reasons for all of them why they're choosing it, but this combination of like the ethos of Ethereum being continued, the real unique community and ecosystem of builders, the collaborative network. We're all in group chats together. We're all talking about how can we make this, how can we improve the OP stack further. And then just this idea of like, again, building, coming together to solve these problems and build a community around that. I think it's something that's kind of starting to take hold and still kind of slept on in the industry. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, what is it like to be in those group chats? Like what are the conversations like behind the doors of all these layer twos talking about how to improve the super chain and what should be rolled out and what should be improved? Yeah,
sure. I mean, from a highlight, it's very positive, right? I mean, I think there's incredible enthusiasm about what's being unlocked here, right? If you just take it from this level of interoperability, and maybe that's a good moment to talk about that a little bit. Like, as you rightly say, we've been talking about interoperability for years. Again, even in 2017, we were already talking about kind of making side chains interoperable, and that was the way that we had to scale. And so I think people are sleeping on this idea of the superchain because they hear it and they think, oh, we've heard this word before. It's superchain, it's interop. But the difference here is that like there's a number of chains, and there's a little bit of separation within the superchain itself. Basically, there's a batch of chains there's a large batch of chains that are part of this collective effort. We're building on the OP stack, and they're contributing some revenue back to Optimism, and because of that, they get the benefit of builders can get retro grants from Optimism, and there's other benefits, but they're not part of it. Then there's this like interop set, which is like a much more small group right now. And the interop set is a group of chains that have consciously made the decision to have the same, very similar underlying infrastructure on the OP stack, right? Because you can take the OP stack and you can kind of modify it a bunch if you'd like. And there's a number of chains who've done that, like Blast. Celo's also doing that a little bit more, like making more customization around it, and still benefiting from being on top of Ethereum and the EVM compatibility, the Ethereum security, but you're not necessarily part of this interop set. But the interop set is a group of chains, again, coming together, making conscious effort to maybe make some trade-offs in terms of infrastructure, but to be aligned and to build this first native interop in Web3, which is super exciting. Like, I think, again, the industry is going to be blown away when it happens. So again, the conversations around that are like very bullish, right? Like, I think there's this sense that the industry doesn't really understand what's coming yet. And you see, within the conversation specifically, it's just people very focused on building, right? Like, and what's cool to see is like, people from like Hayden from Unichain just joined recently, like last week, but like he's already talking to some of the core devs at Base, and like OP and Lisk is jumping in, and they're talking about like, oh hey man, like if you like, can we get this changed on like the blobs? Like we should just put a proposal forward in Ethereum to get the blobs to change XYZ to make that even more efficient. So just seeing like a lot of collaboration and enthusiasm around all these like really talented teams coming together to push it forward. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. Obviously, there's more I could share, but like I think that kind of gives you an understanding of. But it's really like in real time. You're getting kind of like founders. Jesse's in there commenting. You're getting everybody collaborating.
That's super cool. So I wanted to ask you, what will interoperability actually look like with the Superchain? Will it look like no more networks, or liquidity just moves across without you having to choose which chain you're on, or you can use Lisk on Base? Like what will interoperability look like through OP Stack?
That's a great question, and we're starting to talk about it. OP is starting to talk about it, but we need to do a better job. So just to give a few high level things, the idea is that it really feels like one chain, right? So just to give you a few examples of how that looks, like from a user perspective, and I think the OP team's actually been tweeting out a few examples of how it'll actually look, like kind of short video demonstration just in the last week or two. But basically, like if you have a wallet on Lisk, for example, or any of the interop set, you can use any application on any of the subsequent interop chains without having to bridge, right? So if you want to use a Base application, you don't need to bridge, right? So you can just choose, to pay from your own Lisk wallet. So that again, like starts to take a lot of complexity away from a user perspective. From a builder perspective, it's even more powerful, right? Because it allows you to tap into the applications, the users, the TVL, like the liquidity, like you're saying, across the network, right? So like you can build an application on Lisk that, again, routes, again, pools. Let's say you want to have an OP pool on your application, or you want to allow people to kind of buy OP, and that can just be routed through, Velodrome on Optimism, and that'll settle back on Lisk in the same block, right? So it's really like no delay. It's happening immediately in the same block. And I think what that allows, obviously it's very powerful for your application. And it allows, again, like Lisk for us to be like very focused on our markets again, because again, like we can give founders in Indonesia like all our attention, and they don't have to choose about like building on like a super niche chain, right? Like they're going to build on Lisk as like the entry door to the Superchain, but just building on Lisk, you still have full access across the Superchain, right? So you can access all the users on Base. You can access liquidity anywhere on the Superchain, right? So like that power is a total paradigm shift. And like, I think what the next step there, and I think, we're just starting to talk about too, is this idea that like you can build an application from the ground up to be interop first, right? So like to incorporate all these aspects from different chains or applications on different chains and try to attract different user bases kind of from day one. And that's like I'm super excited to see what happens there, because again, like I think people haven't been building like that yet. To see what that unlocks is super does that, you have any further questions on that? That's like a high level. Basically, again, that'll be how it feels, is kind of, you can tap it, you can call functions on other chains, other applications, and it'll settle in the same block back on Lisk. And so you really feel, again, it'll feel like one chain, no bridging.
Yeah, and for us to get to that future, does a lot of the work have to be done by the OP stack and you guys are the OP chain? Or will that be abstracted out into guys like the wallets or the applications? I know there's a lot of people who are working on this narrative called chain abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like an extra chain that sort of abstracts away from the underlying change that they want to abstract from. And so I guess the question is like, where does the work actually have to be done for this to be a plausible future? And how far do you think we are from getting there?
So I mean, I haven't been so involved in the chain abstraction conversation, so I just don't want to say anything wrong. I know that that's happening. What I know from what we're building is that, again, this is coming in the next half a year, probably. That's what that's kind of the timeline we have. So we are very close. I think a lot of the big parts of this has actually been worked out, and it's more just aligning, basically each of the chains to allow interop to work, we'll each run nodes on each other's chains, right? So we'll be able to validate like everything that's happening on all the other chains at the same time. So the high level infrastructure for that to be set up and like the economics of that's already all been worked out. And I think there's a few more technical details that the OP team's working on just to make, one thing, for example, that's being worked on is, what's like a token standard, right? So there needs to be kind of an updated token standard to allow for this kind of permissionless, like you don't need a bridge. It lives on all these chains at the same time. So I think like there's some final touches being put in there. But yeah, I mean, this is coming very soon. I think testnet's actually going to be rolled out in the next, 2 months or so. It might be a beta at first, but like beta first, testnet then afterwards. But this is all coming like really quickly. The question then, I mean, the bigger question I think to what you're getting at is, and for those who are interested, I mean, there is going to be like an Ethereum interop day at DevCon on the 16th, where a bunch of teams across not just the Superchain, but Ethereum as a whole are coming together to kind of talk about how can we make interoperability on Ethereum even more transposable to all players and all L2s. So that conversation is definitely happening. But I do think, again, like the reason that we're able to kind of get started with interoperability here is that, again, like there are specifications that we are deciding consciously to align on, right? That just make, like, again, like one example is block times, right? Like if all the networks have different block times, it becomes very hard to collaborate and make sure that, again, things are syncing back in one block on all these various different networks. So that's just like one example of like something that would need to be figured out if you're going to kind of expand it further. So I do think that's definitely a bigger challenge. I know the Optimism team and Ethereum, I know Vitalik's been talking about it recently. There's obviously, and I think Optimism and the Superchain is leading the way here and showing that there are teams that are willing to kind of prioritize working collectively over just focusing on themselves and what's best for themselves, and making some sacrifices here to kind of build something that's more powerful across the globe. But so again, I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I do think that like again, if you align on underlying infrastructure, I think that becomes relatively possible in the short term. Now, aligning with different types of infrastructure and seeing how, then you could talk about also like DA layers, right? Like if data availability is kind of on all these different layers, how do you make that work across chains? That's another thing that we know would be kind of the next step in our own conversations as well as a interop set on the Superchain. But I do think that that's probably still a little bit further away. And maybe, like you're saying, kind of an abstract layer could help. I know that Polygon's also working on that, right? Like they have their ag layer. I don't know how well that's working at the moment. It doesn't seem like it's getting that much traction. So I from a technical perspective, I'm not sure exactly why that is. But just from like some of the examples I've given you here, like the complexity around doing that is quite a bit more extreme. When you start to take in all these variable factors and allow chains to kind of, have whatever setup they'd like, and then expect to have like real kind of native integrated interoperability.
So just to be clear, you said the testnet is coming out soon. Is that a testnet for the Superchain, or what is that a testnet for?
Yeah, for interoperability. For interoperability, right? Yeah, of the Superchain.
And that will be a separate chain from Lisk?
No. So like the way it'll be rolled out, right? It'll be like if you're building on Lisk, when interop goes live, you won't have to do anything. You'll have native interoperability from day one built into the ecosystem, because it's going to be, it'll be an update in the OP stack, and that'll just be kind of the ones that are part of the interop chain will make that adjustment, make that update, and then that'll go live, and it'll be so they're just testing it out on a test net first, just to make sure everything's running properly with the node validators and things like that. But again, no work from your standpoint, for example, or an application launching on Lisk, there would be no update needed. It'll be seamless.
So I wanted to take a bit of a left turn and talk about your role as the COO of a layer 2 Lisk. Since most of the infrastructure layer and the security layer has been abstracted away by the OP stack, could you give us a bit of an insight as to what is it like to be a COO of a layer 2 for those who are curious? Because I'm sure a lot of people see layer 2s. One of the major things is that you give out grants, but outside of giving out grants, what is it actually like pushing this vision as a COO of Lisk?
Sure. It's a good question. I think so. One thing, again, like you rightfully mentioned, abstracting away the infrastructure, which is now possible with layer 2s, to us, that's a huge benefit again, right? Like that, again, the amount of effort, the amount of team members we had to have to build and maintain a layer 1 network was massive, right? And so to be able to free that developer talent, the engineering talent up to focus more on kind of how can we improve things further, even further from what we're built, what's being built as a group collectively on the OP stack, but also from a product standpoint, or from from a founder or developer standpoint, how can we provide more value to the developer, right? And a lot of that we couldn't focus so much on because we were focused so much on just maintaining an underlying infrastructure. So that's been great. So just again, that abstraction is very powerful. And then it's a good question, right? There's so many layers. What's the difference? What are we doing here? What's our purpose? And I do think, so from the way we see it is that infrastructure levels are a bit like a marketplace, right? I think most similar to maybe a Web 2 marketplace where you have, take Airbnb as an example, right? You have the hosts and you have the users, right? And you need to kind of attract both to create a successful marketplace. And so for us, it's attracting the applications, but also attracting the users in the community to use those applications, right? And it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. You can see that some of the infrastructure platforms, layer 1s, layer 2s that have done very well, obviously they kind of, whether it's Base or Telegram recently with Ton, but if you solve one side of that equation out of the gate with users, 100 million users, for example, that becomes a very attractive marketplace for apps to jump on, right? So in our level as a bit of a smaller player is a bit more challenging, but that's where we can for us, it's again, just to stay true to our ambition that we've always been working towards is how can we help the ecosystem make this technology more accessible and more used, right? And so so for us, we think that we see that building, there is, whether it's in a country like Indonesia or some of the other markets we're in, the idea that one technology platform will rule them all. Maybe from a technological standpoint, but I think, in these markets, personal relationships, connections still go a long way. Building local communities still go a long way. And that takes a lot of effort, right? And so I think where we're really bullish and what we are really focused on is kind of building these local ecosystems and making those really thriving environments, both from an application and founder standpoint, but also from a user community standpoint. And that then can, live on its own and be kind of self-sustaining locally, but then also again, tap into this global network. And if there's founders who have ambitions to be global, which is fantastic, we're also very supportive of that. There's no drawback of building on Lisk, right? So it's kind of this niche ecosystem, with a more focused effort on kind of the applications and the users in that network. But again, like with no limitation then to kind of expand beyond that and tap into what we think is going to be the biggest layer 2 network, collaborative network on Ethereum. So that's kind of how we see it. And so that's what a lot of what I'm doing, right? Like we're trying to, this year was kind of coming to market. We had to kind of transition over from the layer 1. We had to move the token over. We were actually the first layer 1 to fully transition to a layer 2 successfully and also migrate our token to Ethereum. And then kind of, again, just kind of get started, kind of double down on our efforts, whether it's in Indonesia or other markets, and see how that was going. And we've gotten really good responses. So now that's kind of like, for next year, we're even going to push even harder in these areas just to kind of continue, focusing all our efforts on providing value to builders, getting in the most exciting apps and developers, founders into the ecosystem, providing them with the tools and also like the incubator accelerator programs that they need to kind of really turn their idea into something that could be successful. And then, just kind of continuing to build local trust, local communities, being much more present on the ground locally and having more of a presence there. And because I do think, again, like there's a lot around education that still needs to happen in this space. And so, it's doing the things that don't scale still, right? And I know a lot of founders talk about that initially. So that's kind of, again, a lot of my focus is how do we position Lisk? How do we position Lisk as like a doorway to the Superchain, right? And do that in a way that's really collaborative, right? Like we as an infrastructure provider, we have funding that we can provide, and we can we can bring in partners like incubators and maybe, working with governments and stuff, but we're just like one part of the solution, right? And so we work with everybody we work with closely. It's very much kind of an extension of our team. And so how do we kind of keep building that, and who do we work with, to make impact, to help build Web3 awareness, to help train developers, to help create an ecosystem that is attractive to founders and users to be part of, and done in a way that resonates locally, right? And so that's kind of where like key partners like yourself and others come in, where it's just like, we don't run it like, hey, we have this technology and take it or leave it and we'll fund you. We're very like hands-on and looking to build collaboratively with the local teams. And otherwise
and what's
very
next
much like
for
running a
Lisk?
company, like everything else I do is, overseeing the team, setting strategy.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. And what's next for Lisk? I know you guys have a couple of interesting things coming up.
Yeah, so we're actually we have our mainnet live, but we're launching our user mainnet, which is kind of when we start to push kind of bringing users on board at DevCon. So that's about a month away now. And then, there's going to be, there's a number, we have, I think like over 30 apps lined up to go live in the weeks around the user launch, which we're super excited about, and a number of more kind of still in incubator programs and in kind of contract negotiation stages that will also come on. And so, we'll be doing things like, there'll be airdrops to incentivize initial usage. We'll be doing some fun things there for people to get involved in. And then I think that's going to run really nicely, hopefully, into the rollout of the Interop set, which I think will take, the industry by storm. And if you are a builder out there, you can get in touch with me, but follow us on social medias, follow Optimism on social medias. You'll see what's being rolled out there. We're about to launch a new website that'll hopefully explain it a bit more too. And, again, take a look at that, because I just do think that it's just such a unique opportunity to be able to build on this industry first interoperability and take advantage of Base and Sony and World Chain and Unichain. And, again, you can build on Lisk locally and we can support you locally, and you can have access to all these networks. I just think that that's going to, when people realize what's happening there, I think it's just going to really explode. So we think that's kind of the next, let's say 6 to 8 months we see rolling out. And then, beyond that, next year, again, we're looking to kind of, we'll probably be building kind of a developer hub in Jakarta, just to have more of a presence and allow founders to kind of live there and, build a community around that. And obviously we'll be much more involved there. There's a few things kind of in the timeline. We have some, the incubator program with Cominfo is launching. We have one with Angel Hack as well, but also looking at a number of other things with some of the key teams locally. So very exciting to see what's happening. We think, again, being part of the Superchain is a very attractive place for users and builders to be. Looking forward just to kind of take it to the next level and start to build these kind of sticky ecosystems locally.
I think that was a beautiful way to sort of wrap up on the podcast. Dom, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. If you guys want to know more about Lisk, we'll put things in the description, and also about Dom. We'll put things in the description everywhere you can find you, and also on the upcoming programs that they have, all in the description. Thank you guys for listening.
Can I just say one last thing? Sorry, can I want to say one last thing?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. So thank you for having me again. And, just like I think Indonesian Blockchain Week's coming up. I think we're going to be doing an event there. It would be great to see you, Daniel, and the team when we're back in Indonesia later in the year, next year. But yeah, come check us out. Love to meet people in person. And we're very approachable as a team. So yeah, come say hi.
Yes, that's awesome. That's awesome. We'll keep that all in the description. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Dom. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a nice day, everyone.